Morning, everybody. We're just waiting until all the participants populate for Zoom to catch up with all of you. So I think Lori, are we about good to start? She's muted.
Yeah, we have about 24 people so far.
Okay. All right, we'll give it another minute for people populate in. Even though everyone needs to log on and wait for Zoom to get in. But I can start the introduction. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Spring Gardening webinar series presented by the Central Oregon Master Gardeners, Oregon State University, and our sponsors, which you'll see on one of the screens. In fact, I'm on the wrong screen. Sorry. Hold on while I figure this out. Okay, there's our sponsors. Okay, my name is Janet Dart, and I'll be your host. The other Master Gardener assisting behind the scenes is Lori Stolberg. Our presenter is Nicole Bell, a member of the Oregon State University's Garden Ecology Lab. She'll be talking about how backyards and urban landscapes can play a crucial support role for pollinators, especially when they contain the plants and other materials that provide food, habitat, and more for Oregon's diverse bee population. Not only will you leave with a baseline on what bees need to succeed, you will also learn practical information on what to plant for bees, ornamentals, native plants, or both, navigating overwintering and drought in a pollinator-focused garden, and more. But first, some housekeeping for our webinar. All videos and microphones are off except for the presenters. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A window. It should be at the bottom of your screen. We'll reserve time at the end to answer anything that was not addressed during the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available online for a short period following this session. In a few days, you'll be sent an email with a link to access the recording, and we'll also send you any links that Nicole mentions in her presentation. Nicole Bell has spent over 6 years both researching and communicating about both managed and wild bees. She studied the impacts of wildfire on our native bee species, assisted on honeybee health research projects, and the bulk of her expertise is on wild bees in urban and suburban settings. She's passionate about the intersection of humans and bugs and how we can coexist in a way that supports both pollinators and human health and well-being. Nicole is a longtime resident of Oregon and completed both her undergraduate and graduate program at OSU. She has an MS in horticulture from the Garden Ecology Lab and a BS in environmental sciences and sustainable agriculture. And at this point, I will turn things over to Nicole.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, so we'll get over into the presentation. So welcome, everybody. Great to have all of you here today. I'm excited. This is really my favorite thing to do is talk to people about bees. And as she mentioned, most of my research of late focuses on wild bees in urban gardens. And so that's really going to be the focus of today, focusing on pollinator gardens in Central Oregon and covering lots of different things. So I'll bring you through just a little outline of what we're going to talk about today. I'll start with a brief introduction covering why pollination matters, why bees matter, some issues facing bees, and really why we should care about this, why we're all sitting here learning about this today. I'll also talk about some of my research on bees in gardens, which helps us understand what to plant, how that may support or not support certain bee species. And I'll also provide some specific plant recommendations for bees in Central Oregon, as well as some more general recommendations for pollinator gardens, whether you end up moving out of the area or you have friends that are interested in planting somewhere else, some more general recommendations for pollinator gardens at large. So let's start here in our introduction of why do bees matter? Why should we care about any of this at all? And as I'm sure everyone listening already knows, regardless of your background and knowledge of bees, is that pollination is really important. Animals pollinate 87% of flowering plant species worldwide, and bees do most of the pollinating. Wild bees are undomesticated and uncared for by humans, but they provide highly effective pollination services worth billions of dollars every year. Unfortunately, bee population declines have been widely reported in concert with increasing enthusiasm for pollinator conservation. Most of the evidence that we have for bee declines, though, is for bumblebee and mason bee species. And there's over 20,000 bee species worldwide. So there's still a lot we don't know and don't understand about the status of other bee species. We do know that habitat loss and fragmentation are considered primary drivers of bee population decline, amongst others such as pesticide exposure. At the core of this, lack of flowers is a really key issue. Urbanization results in both habitat loss and habitat fragmentation due to the high percentage of impervious surfaces like roadways, sidewalks, buildings, etc. And the rate of urbanization is increasing and is only projected to increase for the next several decades, especially if you consider a city like Bend in Central Oregon that obviously has a large tourist population. It's a lot of people are moving to the area. So there's a lot of demand for housing. And for that reason, also expansion and what was once a natural area or maybe just had soil in general is now being covered up and resulting in habitat loss. Or habitat is being fragmented, meaning that the space between garden to garden or garden to park becomes larger. So there's less connectivity in the landscape, which can result in bee population declines. All is not lost, though, because urban gardens have the potential to contribute individually and collectively to bee conservation. Gardens often have a diversity of flowering plant species, and bees depend on these resources for both pollen and nectar. Pollen is the primary protein source for developing offspring, and nectar serves mainly as a carbohydrate source to power adult flight. In addition, gardens are also usually actively tended by gardeners compared to some other urban green space types, which I'll discuss in a second. In fact, when gardens contain both sufficient floral forage for bees as well as nesting sites, they can serve as what we call a refuge for bees. Urban bee refuge gardens are kind of like a bee buffet in cities that are otherwise like a food desert for bees. Urban gardens are also distinctly different from other urban green space types, such as vacant lots, wasteland, parks, cemeteries, and more, because they typically have high within garden heterogeneity, meaning gardens themselves differ from side to side. There's lots of different plants, or you and your neighbor's garden, for example, they may be a lot different and provide a wide array of resources as well. And when gardens have sufficient floral resources and nesting sites, they can host as much diversity as large parks or even natural areas. I want to go through a couple of examples of just the range of garden styles and availability of resources. So the image here on the left depicts a community garden plot in Portland, Oregon. And as you can see on the left, we've got the I-5 freeway. There's a large parking lot and Portland South waterfront neighborhood to the right. But this community garden can really actually serve as a bee refuge because it has the potential to support a wide array of flowering plant species and also habitat for nesting sites. The image on the right is a back patio. And even though this is all potted plants, these plants still can provide really important food resources for bees. So even though the habitat aspect isn't necessarily there. If someone has a limited amount of space, adding some potted flowering plants could still create more connectivity in the landscape, like I just mentioned, from garden to garden, trying to reduce that distance between food resources and habitat sites for bees. This is one of my favorite examples to show because it really depicts the contrast in gardening preferences and styles and how that might impact suitability for pollinators. These gardens are both clearly very intentionally managed and created, but the result is much different. Some gardens, like the one on the left, are dominated by grass and hedges and a management style that is not privy to high quality bee habitat. Gardens like this one are usually characterized by pesticide use and frequent mowing. The garden on the right is what I would call a true urban floral meadow. It has a variety of flowering plant species, many of which are native. So this garden supports a large diversity of Oregon bee species. It's quite normal for most people when they think of a bee to picture a honeybee or a bumblebee in our head. And that's normal because these bees are widely photographed and circulated by the media, and they're also really easy to spot in a garden setting. I wanted to share, though, that Oregon is home to over 800 species of bees, and these bees come in all sorts of colors, shapes, and sizes with different preferences and habitat needs. So as we move through the presentation today, I'll share with you some of these bees and how we can structure a pollinator garden to meet as many bees' needs as possible. Here's a slide just with some examples of different bee species that we have here in Oregon. And you may look at this image and think that these all can't be bees, but in fact, they are. On the top left, we have a wide-striped sweat bee, Halictus farinosus. On the bottom left, this is one of my favorite species, Agapostamon, or metallic green sweat bee on a blanket flower. And these are one of my favorite bees to introduce to people or have people look for in a garden setting because, again, they're really easy to identify. They're a very fun color. If you have kids that are interested in bees or if you're interested in learning to identify bees to the genus level, this is a really good place to start. On the bottom right is a photo of a male Bombus mixtus, also known as the fuzzy horn bumblebee. And I can tell he's a male because of his skinny legs, since males don't forage for pollen. Even within the genus of bumblebees, there are many different species in Oregon. So Bombus mixtus, this one pictured here, is on the smaller side and is identifiable in part by their orange butt. So even within a genus like bumblebees that is widely recognized and, again, circulated by the media in bee conservation materials, we've got lots of different color variations and sizes within the state. And finally, on the top right, you might look at this photo and at first think that it's a wasp, but it is in fact a bee, and a parasitic bee at that. Parasitic bees, like this bee, Stelis laticincta, enters the nest of its host species and lays its own eggs. And this is really a scheme to get out of the work of pollen foraging. So here we are back at our outline, now that we have just a little bit more background on gardens and bees in general. I'm going to give you some more information on my master's research, which again focused on wild bees in urban gardens, really focusing on the diversity of bee needs and preferences, and tie it back into how this will affect our plant choices. I like to talk about and introduce bee functional traits because they can really impact how successful or unsuccessful a particular bee species might be in an urban garden. All of the bee species around the globe display a variety of functional traits across their preferred nesting substrates, their diet, their social behaviors, and more. And these different preferences put certain species at higher risk for population declines and in more need of habitat in certain urban areas. So I'll walk you through these traits one by one. So the first trait that I like to include and was included in my research was sociality, eusocial, non-eusocial bees, and parasitic bees. We also look at preferred nesting substrate like soil, cavity nesters, hive nesters, wood excavators, and aerial nesters. I also looked at diet breadth, generalist bees or polylectic bees, specialist or oligolectic bees, and no pollen or parasitic bees. And finally, the native status of bees, native or exotic. So let's go through these one by one and provide some examples so we can better understand just the diversity of bees that might be taking up residence in a pollinator garden in Central Oregon. When most of us think of bees, we probably think of eusocial bees. Again, you might think of a honeybee hive or a bumblebee colony. Bees, though, display all sorts of different social behaviors, and eusocial is just one of them. So there's 3 distinct qualifications for a bee species to be considered eusocial. First, the colony of a eusocial bee species must have overlapping generations. So females and daughters are occupying the colony at the same time. If you think of a queen honeybee, for example, she's laying eggs. Those eggs then turn into adult workers, and the queen and the workers are occupying the colony at the same time. Second, there must be cooperative brood care. Again, in a honeybee colony, you have what we call nurse bees, which are all caring for the queen's eggs together. And finally, there must be division of labor by a sterile worker caste. So again, in honeybee colonies, we have foraging workers, which are the girls, the female foragers that you see out and about on flowers. You also have guard bees, which protect the nest entrance. You have nurse bees, which care for brood, and the queen, who lays eggs. The non-eusocial category encompasses different levels of non-eusocial bees. I'm going to mainly focus on truly solitary bees because most bees around the world are truly solitary. About 70% of bees around the world are solitary, which goes to show that being eusocial, honeybees, bumblebees, are really the exception and not the rule when it comes to bee social behavior. In a solitary bee, the female does all of the work. One female does all of the work, foraging for her offspring, provisioning her offspring with pollen and nectar, building and protecting her nest. Within the non-eusocial category, you also have some other levels, such as bees that may share a common nest entrance, but are still individually doing all of their own work, or bees that nest in close proximity to one another. Finally, we have parasitic bee species. And again, you might look at this photo and think that looks just like a wasp or a yellow jacket, but it is actually a bee. This is, again, a parasitic bee, which enters the nest of its host species and lays its own egg on top of a pollen provision provided by its host. I'll now go into talking about preferred nesting substrate for bees. The first one being soil. Now, just like most bees around the world are solitary, most bees around the world nest in the soil, between 65 and 70%, according to the book, The Solitary Bees. And these bees excavate nests in the soil. So a great example is all Andrena species, which are also known as mining bees. So these bees actually dig a hole in the ground and create their nest from there. Many bees also nest in pre-existing cavities. So these might be pithy stems or abandoned rodent holes in the ground. The image on the right here is a bee, a leafcutter bee that built a nest here in this stake that we have in one of our plots and stuffed it with Clarkia petals. Cavity nesting bees can also take advantage of many artificial substrates in urban areas like PVC pipes, birdhouses, even discarded straws. An example of a cavity nesting bee is Megachile rotundata, also known as the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee. I also created a category for those bees that nest in hives, as you can see a managed honeybee colony on the left. But I also want to point out that not all eusocial bee species nest in hives. So I created the hive nesting category for those species which have extensive built-out structures called pollen pots, which is a food storage system. So if you think of a honeybee colony, in their comb, they have pollen stores, they have bee bread, so they're storing food resources. So the honeybee would be a hive nester, as well as bombus or bumblebee species due to their food storage system. But there's also lots of eusocial bees which nest in the soil because they don't have food storage systems. I also included these two nesting strategies, which are not common in Central Oregon, but because my review was a global review, I did include them overall, and I just think they're interesting to learn about. The one on the top left are aerial nesting bees, and these bees build a freestanding nest made out of plant resins. On the bottom right, we have wood excavating bees. One that you might be familiar with is Xylocopa, or large carpenter bees. They're a lot more common on the East Coast. And these bees are cavity nesters, but what makes them different is that they're actually excavating that wood on their own, creating that cavity on their own. But again, you really don't see any of these nesters in Central Oregon. You're going to see soil nesters, cavity nesters, and hive nesters. Diet breadth is one of the most important things, in my opinion, to consider when building a pollinator garden. And it's something that a lot of us, I know when I first started studying bees, I had no idea what diet breadth meant when referring to bees. So it's something I love to share with people. And the most important thing to consider here, if there's one thing that you remember, is that bee diet, meaning the flowers that bees choose to visit and forage, it really exists on a spectrum. At the far right end of the spectrum, you see here is broad polylecty or generalist bees. A great example of a generalist bee is the honeybee, and that's why they are so widely used in agricultural crops, because they will pollinate just about anything. They forage from over 25% of the available flowering plant families. That's not to say that they don't have preferences, because honeybees or bumblebees, another very common generalist bee, of course, have preferences of what they may choose to pollinate. But for the most part, they can forage from lots of different things in the landscape. If we go all the way down to the left end of the spectrum, you'll see here specialist bees. Now, typically, we call these oligolectic bees. They forage from one plant family between 2 to 4 genera, meaning that their needs are a lot more specific than a generalist bee. So if we think of a pollinator garden, something we need to keep in mind is that if we want to support as many bee species as possible, we need to consider the specialist bee species that we have in the area and what those bees specialize on. Because if those plants are nowhere to be found, well, then those specialist bees are also going to be nowhere to be found. So considering diet and the needs of specialist bees is really important when constructing a pollinator garden. And as you can see on the spectrum here, there's really a range, right? It's hard to categorize bees as strict generalists or strict specialists, because some of them may choose to forage from 1 to 3 plant families. Monolecty, or foraging from one plant family, is quite rare. So there is a little bit of room for flexibility even within specialist bees. Finally, I took information on the native status of bees found in urban gardens, and this is relatively self-explanatory. Were the bees found native to the region of study, or were they exotic, non-native to the region of study? So I'll take you through some of the results of my systematic review, my research, which the goal of my study was to gain insight on bees found in urban gardens and their traits. Again, what I just talked about, what is their sociality? What is their diet breadth? To get more of an idea of what types of bees are succeeding in urban garden habitats. As I said, this was a global review, so I studied gardens all around the world, and I ended up with about 28 study sites and hundreds of gardens studied. But this map shows you that there's a pretty strong geographic bias in our research of bee species. So I really come into these results understanding that there's a lack of information about bees in the Southern Hemisphere as well as Asia, though we do have a lot of information on bees in North America, which does pertain quite well to the presentation that we're focusing on today. So after looking at all of the bee species found in urban gardens, I documented between 674 to 830 bee species. 674 represents a conservative measure and only includes bee species listed to the true species level. 830 represents our liberal measure, which includes those bees listed also to the genus level that could not be identified to the species level. And about 70 of these bee species were found in Portland. And again, Portland, Oregon as a whole is home to a lot of different bee species. We're really a hotspot for bee diversity because Oregon has so many different ecological landscapes. We have coast, we have desert, we have mountains, lots of different things. We saw a diverse representation of functional traits. So again, one of the functional traits that I looked at was preferred nesting substrate or nest types. So most bee species worldwide, again, nest in the soil between 65 and 70%. As you can see by that black bar above the far left column, that is our expected global representation. We see here that most bees in urban gardens also nest in the soil, though this number is about 54%. So soil nesting bees are underrepresented in urban garden habitats. Other studies have found this same result and suspect that the general lack of ground nesting sites available in cities is to blame. What I didn't find, though, was an extreme overrepresentation of cavity nesting bees. Again, cavity nesting bees can take advantage of all these artificial substrates that urban and suburban areas have to offer, like buildings, PVC pipes, and more. I found that about 33% of bees nest in cavities, so just a little bit overrepresented. So this suggests that gardens could be providing well-suited nesting habitat for garden bees. Nest resources are particularly important for smaller bodied bees, as body size can be predictive of foraging range. So if a bee is small, it means it can't fly as far to find its food, whereas a bumblebee, a much larger bodied bee, can fly a lot further to access floral resources. So it's more important for a smaller bodied bee to have all of its resources in the near vicinity. Opportunities to enhance nesting resources in gardens to support the abundance of wild bee species with varying nesting strategies include provisioning bare patches of soil or adding woody additions such as small logs. And I'll get more into detail about these options later. Again, most species worldwide are non-eusocial, and that's what we see reflected in this bar graph there on the far left column. We found that about 65% of bee species in the metadata set were non-eusocial, and about 19% were eusocial. So if we look there at the yellow column, second from the left, we see that eusocial bees were overrepresented compared to expected global proportions of about 10%. So only 10% of bee species worldwide are eusocial. There are a few possible explanations as to why eusocial bees like honeybees or bumblebees tend to do better in urban environments. Eusocial bees are typically larger bodied, and as I just mentioned, that means they have a longer foraging range. And this is a huge advantage in fragmented habitats where resources can be few and far between. In addition, eusocial bees have the advantage of division of labor. So some bees are caring for the offspring while others are doing the work of foraging for resources. And this is in contrast to a solitary female bee who, again, has to do all of the work on her own, provisioning her offspring, guarding her nest, and so forth. Eusocial bees can also communicate about where the most efficient and fruitful resources are, which a solitary bee cannot do. You might have heard of the honeybee waggle dance, which is a very common way in which honeybees can communicate about where they were just foraging. And that way, eusocial bees can then all go exploit this really fruitful, nectar-rich resource, whereas a solitary female has to do all of that work, again, on her own. A pleasant surprise was seeing that parasitic bee species, second from the right, were well represented when we examined the comprehensive metadata set. We found that about 13% of bee species were parasitic, which is on par with expected global proportions. And it may sound like parasitic bee species are not something that you would want, but they actually serve as an indicator of overall community health, because in order to support parasitic bee species, there need to be sufficient populations of their host species. We're now looking at diet breadth. And once again, bee diet is highly nuanced and can be difficult to categorize. We do know that most bees worldwide are polylectic or generalist, and that's what we see reflected here. We found that 64% of bee species in urban gardens were polylectic. The ratio of generalists to specialists can change depending on geographical region across the world, but this is about what we would expect to see, especially considering that many of our studies came out of the United States. Another pleasant surprise was seeing that specialist bees, they're second from the right, were well represented in our data set, with 13% of all bee species being specialists. That specialist foragers made up about 13% of foragers, suggests that gardens can support the specialized life history of some bee species, which could be an area to build upon for continued urban bee conservation efforts. When looking at the comprehensive species list, again, all of these 830 bees, far and away, most species were native to the region of study. Some studies have found a high richness and abundance of exotic bee species in urban gardens, but overall, we found a relatively low number of exotic bee species. Some exotic species can be numerically abundant and dominant components of urban gardens. A potential indicator of exotic species could be whether a study occurred at a major port of entry like New York City, but many of the exotic bee species that we found occurred everywhere, including Arizona, Portland, and Pennsylvania. I wanted to examine the garden bee metadata set in more than one way, though. One of the ways I did that was looking at which bees were the most abundant. So again, when I look at all of the species found, I found a lot, 830, but some of those bees may have been found one time in one garden. So I wanted to look at the 5 most abundant bees in each study, which would give me a much smaller species list. It gave me a list of about 70 bee species, and it paints a little bit of a different picture than our comprehensive metadata set. The percentage of eusocial bees was 31.5%, an increase of over 10% compared to the comprehensive metadata set. The proportion of exotic bees increased too, to about 8%. And generalists dominated the most abundant bees, though we still did find 3 abundant specialized bees. Though many bees specialize on asters, including 2 of our abundant garden bees, host plant specializations, or what bees choose to specialize on, are not limited to the aster family, of which sunflowers are pictured here, a very popular choice, suggesting that a broad representation of plant families in a garden may be best suited to supporting specialist bee species. I also wanted to look at which bees were the most dominant across all gardens. So this gave me a list of just 5 bee species. Which bee species were the most frequently reported across all studies? And the question I'm really looking to answer here is, when you go to any garden, really around the world, what bee species are you going to find? This list shows us that many of these dominant bees are exotic to the United States. The western honeybee, Apis mellifera, the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, Megachile rotundata, and the wolf carder bee, Anthidia menicatum. This could suggest that exotic bees are disproportionately benefiting from urbanization compared to native bee species. Both Halictus bee species that we found were found within their native ranges, but they were highly abundant within them. These are all also larger body bees, and most of them are eusocial, which once again points to possible advantages for large, eusocial, and generalist bees in urban settings. So what does it all mean? When we look at all of this data, what are the key take-home points that we should consider when building or thinking of creating a pollinator garden? Well, as we just learned, urban gardens can quickly become dominated by exotic, generalist, and eusocial bees, which overall leads to less diverse bee communities. In addition, sufficient forage and nesting sites are needed for a garden to actually be considered a true bee refuge. Another thing that we learned is that early spring forage is needed because across my research, Andrena species or mining bee species tend to come out in the early spring. They're one of the first bees to emerge, and they also tend to specialize. They have a high rate of specialization. And we found they were really underrepresented in garden habitats, suggesting that we need more flowers that bloom in the spring, and we also need to support specialist bees. Finally, my favorite piece of general advice when thinking of a pollinator garden is really to do less. It's helpful to bees to have some messy spaces, which can be really hard as a gardener, especially if you're very used to or accustomed to very tidy spaces. Now, of course, you can still have your garden look the way you want it to, and just consider again that leaving some bare patches of soil, adding some woody additions, or leaving a pile of leaves in the corner for overwintering queen bees. All of that is actually really great and important bee habitat. So sometimes doing less actually does more for bee species. So now into the fun part, I'll go through some specific recommendations of what do we plant? What do we plant in a pollinator garden in Central Oregon? What about climate change and drought? And what about these special considerations for bees? How do we fit it all in? So I'll go through first the Central Oregon pollinator plants. And I also want to say that this is by no means an exhaustive list of every pollinator plant that you could plant. It's really just to give some ideas of the diversity of plants available as pollinator plants, and also considering some different bloom times and other things which I will get into. So when we think of a pollinator-friendly plant, what does that actually mean? Well, a pollinator-friendly plant should have either or both pollen and nectar. Pollen, again, serves as the primary protein source for bees. It's absolutely essential. And nectar serves as a carbohydrate source for adults and is also mixed into offspring food provisions. Some plants may offer both a pollen and nectar reward, as we call it. Some plants may only offer a pollen reward. Some plants may be predominantly nectar driven. So there's different things happening there, and a great pollinator plant will have both. Other fun bee supplies that bees collect from plants include petals, leaves, plant resins, and more. A really common plant that we have here in the valley is Clarkia or Farewell to Spring. It's a really common plant to see petal cuts in by leafcutter bees because, again, they'll stuff their nest with it. So there's lots of things that bees use plants for, flowers for, beyond just pollen and nectar. The first plant I wanted to share with you is chokecherry, which you can mostly buy in container seedlings. This plant blooms in the spring or summer, and it's a large shrub or a small tree. One of the great things about chokecherry is that it also produces fruit for birds and other animals, and the flowers are great for bees. It also has attractive fall color foliage, and if you're someone that likes to make jam, the fruit can be used for jams as well. Another plant, this is one of my personal favorites, is green manzanita. It's a nice little rounded shrub with pink flowers in April, and it's a great spring bloomer, which again, I'll talk about this more, but having some variety in when the plants are blooming is really important. Another great option is Western columbine. This is a beautiful flower. It's a short perennial, and hummingbirds also love it. If you're someone that likes to support lots of different pollinators, Western columbine is a great option. It's a late spring and summer bloomer, and it's relatively easy to grow as well. Gray rabbit brush blooms for a long time, and it's a very important end of season resource for bees and queen bees about to overwinter. It also works for butterflies. Like I said, it blooms in the late summer, fall, and it blooms for a long time. So it's really going to support that end of season time, which is very critical. Really, the shoulder seasons are something that I love to have people take home and remember because, of course, summer blooming plants are important. And the shoulder season, the early spring, the spring, the late summer and fall bloomers are really what's going to separate a fine plant pollinator garden from a great pollinator garden. This is a rounded shrub. The leaves are very fragrant, I will say. So some people may not like the smell of this plant, but some people say that the leaves smell like pineapple. So it's really dependent on the person. And this plant can be cut back after fall to prevent seed dispersal. There's also other Ericameria species in Central Oregon that are great options as well. So again, this isn't an exhaustive list. It's really just some ideas. Goldenrod is another one of my personal favorites. It's another late summer, fall bloomer. It's got beautiful sort of yellow tendril-like flowers. It's an herbaceous perennial. It can get quite tall. And it does tend to sucker. So maybe plant it in an area where you're okay with it taking over a bit, or to fill in an area or a gap in your garden. It also plays very well with aster, which is another one of my favorites. And again, there's different aster options. Asters are really common in low to mid elevations in the North Cascades. They're typically found in dry soils and along streams, but you can really plant them anywhere. They are true summer bloomers, and they also bloom into the fall. So for that reason, they pair really well with goldenrod. It's kind of a famous combination referred to in braiding sweetgrass. Their growth habit is an annual. They can also overwinter in some cases and be a short-lived perennial. They also can get pretty tall. So goldenrod and aster, again, great plants to plant somewhere where you've got a lot of space. You're kind of okay with them taking over a little bit. I think they're absolutely beautiful. So it really depends on your personal preference. Fernleaf biscuit root is another great option. This is a springtime bloomer, and it's a perennial. It's got these kind of flat-topped flowers, which the shape of flowers, the habit of flowers, can also determine what types of pollinators may do best or may prefer to land on these flowers. So these flat-topped flowers like this are really popular with short-tongued bees or smaller bees, which can land directly on the flower. But again, lots of bees will use different flowers. So it really just comes down to preference a lot of the time for those bee species. Common yarrow is another really flat flower that is super easy to grow. It's tolerant of drought conditions, and it can even be a replacement for lawn if mowed infrequently. It's a spring into summer bloomer, and again, it's one of these taller sort of herbaceous perennials. The lupine genus as a whole is just a wonderful choice. I think they're absolutely beautiful. They're late spring, early summer bloomers, another herbaceous perennial. They tend to do well in heavy, well-drained soils at relatively low elevations within the Cascades. But there's lots of lupine species that grow well east of the Cascades. So it really, again, comes down to preference and what you're interested in having in the garden. Lowly penstemon is something you might see in sunny or open habitats. Again, it tolerates drought and infertile soil very well. And usually full sun, but can also be in partial shade. And again, lowly penstemon itself is an example, but there's lots of different penstemon species available in Central Oregon. It's a late spring, early summer bloomer, another herbaceous perennial. Threadleaf phacelia is a spring and early summer bloomer. It's an herbaceous annual. And again, it can get up to 2 feet tall. So it's a really nice addition. And these different heights can also provide just some visual interest to the garden, right? You have some lower bloomers, as well as some plants that get a little bit taller. And as for another shrub, this is all over Central Oregon, wax currant or western red currant. The flowers themselves on this species are white, but the fruit is red. These love well-drained soil. They're drought tolerant, of course. It's a woody shrub. So it's nice to have a mix of shrubs like manzanita or currant, as well as some annuals, perennials, to provide just, again, visual variety and actual variety in terms of lifespan and that sort of thing. So of course, I know something we all really consider in this day and age is planting with climate change and planting with drought. I'm going to keep it really simple because plants really aren't my area of focus. And when it comes to native plants, most of these native plants, all the ones I just mentioned, should be well adapted to the local climate because they're native. This includes dry summers. That being said, even native plants are not immune to dry spells and especially hot heat waves during the summer. So if you see signs of drought stress on plants, including floppy leaves, you should provide the plants with water. But if you focus on native plants, then the maintenance required for the local climate, right, is relatively minimal most of the time. Cold hardiness is along the same note. Native plants should be well adapted to the cold winters in Central Oregon. Exotic ornamentals may need extra supports, like pots being brought inside, or you can cover the plants with clear tarp, etc. And all potted plants should be brought indoors or covered up with clear tarp to create kind of a DIY greenhouse below 27 Fahrenheit, because at that point, right, in a potted plant, the roots are not in the ground. So they're going to be exposed to the cold, and that's when you see really big problems. I also want to talk about these special considerations for bees. So when you're building a pollinator garden, what is kind of a checklist of the things you should consider in order to support as many bee species as possible? So here's our list, and I'm going to go through these categories one by one and talk about them in a little bit more detail. The first thing is temporal distribution. So again, bee species are active during different times of the year. If you think of a honeybee or a bumblebee, eusocial bee species, they're active throughout the whole season because these are very long-lived colonies. They overwinter, etc. So they're looking for resources all throughout the year. Then you also have bees, which are early spring. Here in the valley, Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard mason bee, is a really early emerger. It pollinates a lot of orchard crops, which is how it gets its name. But it really is only active through April, and then you don't see it anymore. So it's important to have those early spring/spring resources. Everything's a little bit later, of course, in Central Oregon than it is here in the valley. And you also want to have summer resources, which usually is covered. Most people are great about planting summer flowering resources. And again, fall is like a key time. Pick a couple really good fall flowering plants to support those end of season bees. Again, bumblebee queens about to overwinter. They need resources too. So thinking about those shoulder seasons, spring and fall, as well as your summer flowering plants. Also want to think about the resources that the plants that you're choosing provide. Do they provide both pollen and nectar? Do they provide pollen alone? And plants that just provide a pollen reward, a great example is California poppy. It only provides a pollen reward. Still a great pollinator plant. It's very popular amongst bumblebees. So even if a plant only provides one quote unquote reward, it still could be a wonderful option that supports lots of bees. But again, you want to have in the garden plants that end up providing both pollen and nectar, as well as, again, some of those other resources. You might think about plants that have little woolly leaves that, like gray rabbit brush, actually, different bee species like Anthidium, they may collect these for their nests. So bees use lots of these different resources. Nesting sites is also something important to consider. So again, in a pollinator garden, you want to leave some patches of bare soil for soil nesting bees. And you also might consider adding some woody additions. So this could be logs, it could be pithy stems. Say you've got some raspberries or blackberries in your garden. You cut back some of those dead canes, but leave them somewhere discreet in your garden because cavity nesting bees may take interest in them. And finally, something that is kind of the question of the hour, it seems, as of late, I've been hearing about it a lot, is when we start thinking about the native status of plants. And there's several layers here that we can delve into. And many people have strong opinions about what should be done in regards to native versus non-native plants and as they relate to potential benefit to pollinators. Native status might refer to wild type natives, native cultivars, or exotic ornamentals. So does it matter? The main question is, does it matter? Does it matter what we plant? So before we answer this question, let's do a little bit more background on what the definitions are of these plants and how you might identify them at a nursery. So what is a wild type native plant? As defined by the NRCS, a plant that is a part of the balance of nature that has developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. So these are plants that have been in Central Oregon for a long time. What is a native cultivar then? Well, really the name comes from cultivated variety. It's a plant variety that has been produced in cultivation by selective breeding. Cultivars are usually designated in this style, so they usually have a name attached to the true species name. And then finally, what is an exotic bee species? This is any plant or animal species that are not found in an area naturally and were either introduced intentionally or by accident. So a great example of a popular exotic pollinator plant choice would be lavender. If you're ever curious about the native status of a plant, these are two great resources. You can use plants.usda.gov or OregonFlora.org is one of my personal favorites. Super easy to use, great resource. So when you go to a nursery, buying what you're after actually isn't always as simple as it seems. Reading the labels of plants can be a little bit confusing. So let's say you're interested in purchasing yarrow for your pollinator garden. It's one of the plants I mentioned earlier. You go to the nursery, but there's all these different options available. So how do you know which one to choose based on plant tags alone? And the first question you want to ask yourself is, well, what type of plant do you want to buy? What do you actually want for your garden? Because that's a really important question too. Now, all of these different tags actually mean something different. So on the far left here, we see this plant tag says Western yarrow. So this is a locally adapted yarrow cultivar to the western side of Oregon. So this would be a locally adapted yarrow cultivar to the Willamette Valley. If we looked second from the left, we see a native morphology. So this is a quote unquote wild type native plant, Achillea millefolium, white yarrow. And we know this because if we look at the tag here, it's quite small. You can see Achillea millefolium. There's no name, there's nothing else attached to it, just the true species name. Second from the right, we see our hybrid cultivar. And this is identifiable because up at the top of the tag here, we just see Achillea. We don't see Achillea millefolium. And then we see it has a name. It's called Desert Eve Deep Rose. This indicates a hybrid cultivar, meaning two or more different species of Achillea were bred together to produce this hybrid cultivar. On the far right, we see a native cultivar. So this tag says Achillea millefolium, so it is a full species name, but then it has a super fun name, Sassy Summer Sangria. So that's how we would know that this is a native cultivar. Well, now we're back at our question. So does it matter? Does it matter if it's a native? Does it matter if it's a native cultivar or an exotic ornamental? Like I said, some people have really strong opinions about planting with all natives, etc. I am of the opinion that there is no one right way to garden. Of course, there are benefits to native plants, and gardens that include native plants are going to serve more pollinators and support more biodiversity than those that don't. That doesn't mean, though, that cultivars or exotic ornamentals have no place in gardens or that they don't add ecological value. They certainly can, and there's evidence that they do. There's lots of reasons that you might choose to plant a native cultivar or an exotic ornamental. On the picture on the screen here, I have a photo of a yarrow cultivar. The first is beauty or aesthetic value. A lot of the times, native cultivars or exotic plants, right, they're popular for a reason. They're sold for a reason. They add color variety or height variety. And this is important when it's a garden that you look at or you want people to be interested in. Creating it beautiful and in a way that means something to you is important to consider. The next is hardiness and disease resistance, right? Some of these plants are bred for a very practical reason. They may be more drought tolerant. They might be disease resistant. So that could be a very valid reason for choosing one of these over the wild type native or in addition to the wild type native. Tradition or cultural significance is also something that is really important to consider. You may love having tropical plants in your garden. Are they the most practical? Absolutely not. But can they be a super fun addition and add lots of variety to a garden? Absolutely. And finally, just for fun, you might want to plant something just because you like it. And that is reason enough alone to plant something. Here we are back at our outline, recommendations, overall, more general recommendations for pollinator-friendly gardens that you can take with you to use in Central Oregon, and you can also take with you to use in other areas, anywhere else around the world that you might be visiting, planting, recommending things for a pollinator garden. The first thing is plants. So again, you want to choose plants that bloom across the season from your early spring to late fall in the region. You want to mix annuals, perennials, ground covers, shrubs, trees. So you have a lot of variety, not just for the human eye, but also in terms of height, because all bees are different, of course. So some bees might be foraging a little closer to the ground. Some bees might be foraging a little higher up in trees or high shrubs. So having lots of variety in lots of different ways is always the best to support different pollinators. Also, you want to think about including nectar sources and pollen sources. So some really popular great nectar sources are asters, mints. Lavender is a mint. Great exotic plant. There are some hardy cultivars for Central Oregon. Again, it's exotic, but it's a wonderful choice in combination with natives, in my opinion. Columbine, rosaceous trees and shrubs, etc. And pollen sources. So these are your asters, again, your poppies, rosacea, phacelia. These are great options. You also want to think about nest sites. So you want to leave bare patches of soil. You could leave tipped berry canes, dried, hollow, pithy plant stems, again, woody logs, things like that. Something I also want to touch on is that bee boxes and insect hotels are very popular. They're very cute. And I would say avoid them unless you plan to provide them with regular maintenance. Because really insect hotels, if they are not maintained, can become home to a lot of things that you probably don't want in your garden, like parasites, other species that could actually harm bees more than benefit. Finally, overall maintenance recommendations. There's one thing that you take away. It's to do less. Maintaining messy areas in your garden is one of the best things that you can do for pollinators. Some more practical tips include reducing mowing and the use of chemical or natural pesticides, of course, and leave the leaves. Leave the leaves for overwintering insects, queen bumblebees, of course, but then there's also other insects that might use them as well. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about bees or pollinator gardens in general, I have a couple of links here for you. The first is the Portland Bee Guide. This was part of my master's research. And although this study that this guide is based on was out of Portland, so the Willamette Valley, a lot of these bee species are found all over Oregon. And really the overall message of the guide in urban gardens applies to lots of different places. And the relatively easy genus level, basic level identification tools. It's not an identification guide. It's really just to familiarize with different colors, shapes, etc. is applicable for bees in Central Oregon as well. I'll see if I can, I don't think I can copy that link in the chat now, but I'll make sure that all of you have direct access to it, as well as the iNaturalist guide. This accompanies the written guide. It's called Summer Garden Bees of Portland on iNaturalist. And there you can see photos of every bee species as well as different tags. So you can look for green bees. You can look for very large bees or very small bees. You can look for early spring bees. You can filter for specialist bees or generalist bees. So it's a really fun interactive tool to use to familiarize yourself with what types of bees that you might be seeing in your garden. And finally, again, if you're really interested in learning more about pollinator plants, in Central Oregon, the Deschutes Land Trust has a great resource, which I link to here. And honestly, like OSU Extension, there's lots of great resources available there as well. Just a couple of acknowledgements. I did graduate from the Garden Ecology Lab back in November, and my research was supported by Sherry Shang and Spike Wadsworth, as well as these grants, and just everybody in the Garden Ecology Lab, Gail Ingalato, Jen Hayes, Devin Johnson with his photos, all really important components of this research. So I can't thank them enough. And that is all I've got for you today. So I would be happy to answer any questions that you all have. And thank you so much for listening.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I have some questions, but I'll wait for everybody else to get theirs. And we have several in already. So if you all in the audience have more questions, just pop them in the Q&A, and I'm going to go ahead and field them to Nicole. Just take them as they came. We have three upvotes on this one. How do you tell a wasp from a parasitic bee?
That is a great question. And it's a question that we get a lot. So the main answer here that I'll give you is parasitic bees are hard to find. They're difficult to spot. So I would say if you're in doubt, it's probably a wasp, because wasps are a lot more ubiquitous across garden landscapes. And parasitic bees, they can be seen. It takes a little bit more work, but they're identifiable mostly because of their eyes are really in the front of their head. They've got their antenna, and you're going to see them nectaring on flowers. Wasps will sometimes nectar on flowers as well, but they're usually going to be seen flying low to the ground, searching for their predators, so other insects, whereas parasitic bees are vegetarians. They're not hunting or looking for any other insects. So you're going to see them most likely sitting on a flower nectaring, or not see them at all. So if you see something buzzing around your plate of food or hovering around you, it is more likely than not a wasp.
Thank you. I always wondered that. Great explanation. There's another one that got an upvote, so we have at least 2 people interested. And what is a common radius for eusocial bees? And how do wild bees versus domestic honeybees interact? There's a lot of questions in this one. And will they coexist, or does one fight off the other one for territory?
Great. I'll probably need you to repeat the second half of the question after I.
Let's start with common radius for eusocial bees.
Common radius. So it depends. The answer is it depends. If you think of something like a honeybee or a bumblebee, these are large body bees. They may fly miles. Honeybees can fly miles, in the range of miles. Bumblebees are flying in the range of miles. If you think of a smaller body bee, a tiny bee might be flying in the range of meters, like 100 to 500 to 1,000 meters. Most bees probably around a kilometer. Sometimes it's confusing to start mixing mixing metrics, but smaller body, medium body bees are usually going to be flying under a mile, whereas eusocial bees can easily cover over a mile. And that's a more general way to think about it. But the answer is it depends. It depends on the bee. It depends on the species. So even within eusocial or large body bees, that range can depend. It also can depend on the temperature. When it's colder, bees can't fly as far. When it's too hot, bees can't fly as far. So it really depends on a very specific situation. But this, the general rule is that larger body bees can fly further. Smaller body bees can't fly as far.
Thank you. So I guess if I have a pollinator garden and my neighbor across the street does, it's helpful because they're within a mile. So
of course. Yes.
Okay.
That's anyone in like the neighborhood, say if you're in like a subdivision, anyone in the neighborhood, bees can fly from flower to flower. It's once you get maybe the other side of town or out of town that maybe the bigger bees are the ones that are actually flying to those further resources.
Great. Thank you. The other half of that question was, how do wild bees versus domestic honeybees interact? And will they coexist, or does one fight off the other one?
It's a great question. And it's something that there's not a lot of evidence. What it is competition. So there's not a lot of evidence on bee competition. And what we do know is that honeybees can competitively exclude other bee species. So what I like to tell people is, if you're interested in bee conservation, getting a honeybee hive is not going to do anything for bee conservation. And that's just the reality of it. Becoming a hobbyist beekeeper is not contributing to bee conservation. And are there valid reasons to want or keep a honeybee hive? Absolutely. If you want honey, if you want to learn about bees, if you're just interested in bees, that is reason enough to get a honeybee colony. And if you're interested in supporting bee biodiversity or native bee conservation, a pollinator garden is going to do a heck of a lot more than a honeybee hive in your backyard. And so the answer is, again, in ecology, it usually is, it depends. Can honeybees exclude native bees? Absolutely. And it really comes down to the reason of, say you have a really nice big flowering shrub in your pollinator garden. It's got lots of nectar, it's in full bloom, and you or your neighbor, someone nearby has a honeybee colony. And those bees start to, we call it facultative specialization. Even though honeybees are generalists, they'll forage from lots of different things. They see that resource. They're like, wow, this is awesome. There's so much happening here. And then they start communicating. And then all the honeybees from that colony are going to start using that shrub, which is great for the honeybees. And say, if that's an important resource for a smaller bodied bee, well, at the end of the day, honeybees are larger bodied bees. So can they competitively exclude a smaller bodied bee that's also trying to use that resource? Yes. So, and it depends. So at the end of the day, the answer is honeybees absolutely can competitively exclude other species. And for that reason, I'm actually working on a paper on this right now with my colleague Jen, is that including a variety of plant species helps with that. That's why I actually love recommending lavender. It's an exotic plant. And honeybees and bumblebees, these large eusocial bees, love lavender. They absolutely love lavender. So when you have lavender in a garden, there is some evidence in our research to support that honeybees and bumblebees will go to lavender, which then frees up these other resources, often native flowering plants, for native bees. So that's why, when I talk about native plants versus exotic plants, it's not so simple as, well, a pollinator garden should be all native plants, because again, we're dealing with both native and non-native bees. So the answer is, and I'll say this again, it depends. It always depends on a case-by-case basis, really. And that's why exotic plants can actually play a really important role and an ecologically beneficial role in pollinator gardens.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I love our simple questions, and there's always a huge answer, and it depends. This is from an early on when you were first talking. One of our people want to know, what is a substrate?
A substrate, like a nesting substrate. So that would be like soil would be one nesting substrate, and then wood would be another nesting substrate. Plant resin would be another nesting substrate. So it's really the material that a bee is choosing to nest in or nest with.
Great, thank you. Deborah would like to know, do you have a plant family list associated with a bee that we could use for planting in a container garden?
A plant list for a container for pots, like a family list. I don't know of one that currently exists. And I would say that if you're planting for a container garden, you can really follow the same structure or guidelines as you would follow for any other pollinator garden. So I would say, plant some Asteraceae, some asters, you can get some annuals in there, you can get columbine, you can do a lot of things do well in pots. So I'm not sure of a list that exists. That would be a great list to work on. But I would say generally you can use the other rules and recommendations to put things in containers.
Great, thank you. Deborah has another question. Do soil nesting bees nest in a raised bed?
They might. I will say I don't, there's not a lot of evidence to support that. I believe in my research, I'm not sure if they ever specified like where, specifically where soil nesting bees were found, if they were found in the ground or in raised beds. I can see that they might choose to do that. One thing about soil nesting bees is the nests are incredibly difficult to find. So even in research, when we find a soil nesting bee, we're flying it foraging around. You're not finding the actual nest 99% of the time. So they're very elusive. We don't really know where they're nesting, but any bare soil is better than no bare soil, just as a general rule. So if you have a raised bed, absolutely leave some patches of bare soil. And if the raised bed is deeper than, say, 24 inches, then odds are that I see no reason that a soil nesting bee wouldn't use it.
Interesting. I didn't know they went down that far. You said down 24 inches.
Oh, some
Wow.
soil nesting bees nest very deep in the ground.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Another question from Anonymous. Does digging in the garden or yard in the spring to plant new plants or move plants around harm the soil for nesting bees that might be nesting in my garden?
I mean, potentially, yes. Could you disturb a bee nest? Potentially. And likely you're not going to do much harm, I would say. It's kind of, it's a necessity, right, in the spring to be doing things out and about in the garden. So you can't really avoid digging. And for the most part, if you do disturb a bee nest, they'll dig somewhere else. So I would say it's possible, yes, that you might disturb a nest. Again, they're very hard to even know where they are. So there's not really a way to be like, oh, I think there's a nest here. I mean, you may occasionally, some of my bee friends have found a nest and they'll flag it in their garden. Unless you see a bee actively go in their nest, you could choose to flag it and then avoid digging right in that area. But if you don't know and you need to dig somewhere, just dig there. And I wouldn't worry about it especially if you're planting a pollinator plant, you're doing a lot more benefit than you could be doing potential harm. So
great. Sometimes I feel afraid to dig in my garden after I hear about all the bees. So thank you. Tony says, nice presentation, Nicole. In your graph that showed social bees were in higher abundance in urban gardens, was there any consideration that this might have been due to the number of honeybee hives in the area?
of course, yeah. So, and keep in mind too, in a lot of these studies, they tried to study gardens that did not have honeybee colonies in them. And as we know, honeybees can fly far. So you're always everywhere around the world, pretty much. Even if there's no honeybee colonies in the area, you're still going to see honeybees. So it absolutely could be because honeybees are such a large component of our bee community assemblages now, even though they're non-native. And bumblebees, like here in Oregon, Bombus vosnesenskii, it's the bumblebee I actually have on this question screen, the yellow-faced bumblebee. It's got the yellow face, yellow fur, very distinct yellow band on the butt. This is a super common bumblebee. If you see a bumblebee flying around, especially in the Willamette Valley, it's usually what we call Bombus vos. So it's usually, yes, these eusocial bees that dominate urban gardens are honeybees, a couple bumblebee species, and then also those like Halictus sweat bee species that I mentioned as well. Again, they're usually larger bodied, they can fly a lot further, and they're just more abundant overall.
Thank you so much. Cheryl would like to know, can bees nest in porch boxes over the winter?
In porch boxes?
Porch, little planter boxes on porches?
They might. I would say most bees don't overwinter. Most bees die. Like the female emerges in the spring, she provisions her nest, and she dies. And her offspring are then in their cocoon, they're developing throughout the winter, and then they emerge in the spring. The bees that do overwinter, of course, honeybee colonies, and then bumblebee queens. Their whole colony doesn't overwinter, but a bumblebee queen will overwinter, sometimes I believe with a few workers, but it depends. So bumblebees certainly have been found in like old bird nest boxes. So, any nesting substrate, again, quote unquote, that's like a box like that could potentially be used by a bumblebee. But it depends. I've personally never found a bumblebee nest like in in our birdhouses or anything. I think they're very elusive. Like in our garden, most of our bumblebees, I believe, are nesting in the soil. Which if there's soil available, bumblebees are probably going to choose soil first, but it really depends on the species. So it's possible that they would. It never hurts to have a resource like that. But don't be surprised if you don't find bees in it over the winter.
But I suppose there might be other insects that might nest, hide out over there in the winter. So it would
Right.
probably help. Thank you. April would like to know if I wanted to set up a natural beehive in our yard, which is large and has a pond, what's a good starting point? I don't want to collect honey or do maintenance. I just want to support more bees. I have a small hive in my front yard in a birdhouse and hope to offer a place by the pond.
I would say so. So again, I'll come back to this sort of general recommendation that if your goal is to support as many bee species as possible, I wouldn't get another hive. What I would do instead is, if you've got the big garden space, I would add more nesting substrate in general. So rather than getting another hive, I would get some option for cavity nesting bees, like those pithy stems, woody additions. You totally could get bee hotels if if you already have a hive. You sound like you're interested in maintenance work. So you totally could get a bee hotel and maintain it every year. And that's a great option to provide housing essentially for cavity nesting bees or leave patches of bare soil. And that way you're supporting a larger biodiversity of bee species and without having to do the maintenance of honeybees.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Another anonymous would like to know, we were talking about this right before they started. When in the spring in Central Oregon can you begin to rake the leaves you left over the winter? And the reason I was talking about it is I was telling Nicole that my daffodils are blooming and where she lives, they've already bloomed and the tulips are up. So our spring is different than theirs. So we're kind of entering spring right now.
I would say like as soon as spring starts, queen bumblebees, you're going to start seeing them flying around. Queen bumblebees look the same essentially as worker bumblebees, but they're just bigger. If you see a really big bumblebee in the springtime, it's probably a queen. They're the ones that emerge first. They start foraging on their own, and then they'll start laying their eggs, their colony, and then the queens stop foraging as much while they're workers. The worker bumblebees that you then see for the rest of the season are the ones that are out and about. And so I would say if you need to rake your leaves when you need to rake them. I would wait maybe until you've had a couple nice spring days and the queens have had a chance to emerge and forage, and then they're going to start looking for a nesting site, like a true nesting site. I've seen in the spring, we have our queen bumblebees here, and you'll see them kind of flying low to the ground, which is them looking for a suitable nesting site. So once you've had a couple of days like that, rake your leaves, and again, the rule is when you need to do something in your garden, like you should do it. It's really about even the fact that you're considering the time to do it is already a great thing. So, if you need to rake the leaves for whatever reason, rake them when you need to. And best practice, I guess you could say, is wait until you've had a couple nice warmer spring days.
That's great, which we are having here now. So let's go out and rake after this. Thank you. I was telling you that we were getting people from the state of Washington now, and this must be one of them because Deborah is asking, do you know of any list of pollinator plants for Western Washington around the Salish Sea?
I'm sure there are. I know that the universities up in Washington have a great pollinator extension program. I know the person that does a lot of the honeybee extension. I'm not as sure of people that are doing wild bee extension work, but honestly, usually if you Google like pollinator lists, if it's put out by an extension service or a university, that's great. Also, you can go on that same website, Oregon Flora, and they do provide like a map which shows the range, and a lot of the plants that are native to Central Oregon or the Willamette Valley, they're also going to be native to parts of Washington. So there's going to be a lot of overlap in planting lists. So Oregon State has a ton of planting lists, and you can look through those and kind of look at the plants, and if their native range also goes into those parts of Washington, then those are also going to be great options for the area too.
Thank you. And it's probably a great idea to go in Washington to the extension offices in Washington because they'll have real specific for that area. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. This reminds me of the next one reminds me, we've got the same question about butterflies, and now it's about bees. What about water needs, and should we provide bee baths?
That's a very common question, and I'm actually really glad you asked that. The answer is no, you don't need to. It's a really common misconception, and again, it's really perpetuated by how much honeybees are circulated in the media. So honeybees will sometimes go to these like shallow water paths. You know, people do like a bird bath with rocks in it or something like that. And that's because in the summer, when it's really hot, honeybees will sometimes kind of collect water and they'll go back to the hive and fan water with their wings to cool the colony down. Other bees get all of their water needs from nectar. So as long as you have plants that are, you know, not super drought stressed and they're producing nectar, then bees have all of the water resources they need. So actually water can end up attracting things you might not want in your garden, mosquitoes. So I would say if you have a honeybee colony, you know, you might consider adding one. But to be honest, even I worked with honeybees for 4 years and we had, you know, 50 colonies on one site with no water resource to be found. And the hives did fantastic because again, the bees get their water needs from nectar. So I would say avoid the trouble and just make sure you've got some good nectar resource plants and you're good to go.
Thank you. Good answer. I think we had the same thing about butterflies too. So we have our birds that need water. Okay, here's another question. This actually reminded me that you go to a nursery and they say pollinator plants, but they very seldom say this is for pollen, this is for nectar. So it's just like in my own mind think of that. Well, now I got to do some more studying. But the question is, how often does the nectar and pollination occur in one plant? If the bees keep coming back to a flower day after day, is there more nectar or pollen, or does it run out?
That's a good question. So it depends. The nectar and pollen is usually produced kind of on like a day by day basis. So just like any other resource, nectar and pollen resources are finite. So, you know, by the end of a day, say the nectar availability in a flower might be pretty much done, which is why, you know, if you've got this plant and there's a ton of honeybees or bumblebees on it, they can quickly exploit that resource and utilize the nectar. But, you know, if it's got sufficient water, again, that nectar source will be kind of refilled throughout its blooming season. Same with the pollen. So it really depends again on the plant and how nectar rich. The availability and the amount of nectar that a plant produces is going to differ. And the availability of that nectar and accessibility of that nectar or pollen to a bee will also be different. So if you think of a blueberry flower, it's got that really characteristic bell-shaped flower. It's quite difficult for, say, honeybees to pollinate it, even though they're brought in very often in blueberries to pollinate. They don't really like to pollinate it because it's hard to access all of the goodies inside. Whereas a bumblebee is large, and as I'm sure you've heard, they do buzz pollination. So they can actually wrap their body around the flower and create this buzzing, which shakes out the resources. So it depends on the flower. You know, a bumblebee is going to be able to exploit a blueberry plant great. And then again, these smaller bees, you might see them more on yarrow, these flat topped flowers, which are a little bit easier for them to access the nectar resources. So it all comes down to, again, having variety. And it's totally fine to have a plant that just produces pollen, totally fine to have a plant that's more nectar rich. And it's great to have a mix.
Thank you. That was active. We have a couple of comments, and that was actually the last question, but I did have one if I could squeeze mine in. We do a lot of people are taking up their lawns here and putting in natives, flowers, and mulch. And so we're covering this soil with mulch, which eventually breaks down. But I'm wondering if, in addition to the mulch, we should be leaving some bare soil, because the mulch is really small wood chips, I would think. Any
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
Mulch is popular and it's definitely not wrong, but I mean, you said it, like leaving some patches of bare soil is helpful. Again, I don't know if there's strong evidence that mulch actually deters soil nesting bees, but I would say it's not necessarily always a natural quote unquote substance like that would be found in a natural ecosystem. So it's best to have some parts of the garden that really mimic sort of a natural ecosystem, bare soil, plants. And again, as that mulch breaks down over time, then the soil would become more accessible as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions. I have some comments I'm going to read, but I want to let everyone know before they drop off that we will be sending those links to you in the follow-up email, along with a link to the recording if you want to listen to it again or review it. Vicky says, great information. I'm glad to know I'm on the right track in my garden, and thank you. And Deborah says, thank you, Nicole, for the additional information when responding to my questions. Great presentation and topic. So excellent. I am just, so if there's no more questions, why I see there aren't, I'm going to share my screen briefly.
Perfect. I'll stop my share.
I think it would have stopped you anyway, but I have
Great.
all power as the host. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and thank you for the questions. That really adds to the seminar. I would like to give a special thank you to our sponsors that you see at the bottom of the screen: McPeter's Turf, Desert Peaks, Whistle Stop, George and Vicky Miner, High Desert Farms, and Schilling's Garden Market. Please support their businesses. And your feedback helps us improve our webinars in the future. So we do have a short survey at the end of this. If you would take a moment to fill it out, we appreciate it. And thank you again, Nicole. That was just fabulous. And she's moving to Massachusetts soon. So we're very lucky to have got her before she left to the other side of the country. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you.